So in this video, we're going to talk about Jane Taylor's play Ubu and the Truth Commission, which was co-produced with William Kentridge and the Handspring Puppet Company. As the title of the play might suggest, this is a post-apartheid South African version of Alfred Jarry's Ubu Roi, or Ubu the King, which was one of the defining plays in sort of bringing the grotesque to the European stage. And so in South Africa, after the fall of apartheid in the early 1990s, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established, headed by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, in an attempt to heal the wounds of apartheid South Africa, basically. So people who were victims of violence could come and testify about what their experience were or what their families' experiences were. And they could basically have their stories heard by the nation and by the world. People who were perpetrators of violence, particularly racially motivated violence, could come and testify for amnesty. And there was a lot of debate about this process in South Africa, especially because there were concerns that by foregoing penalties for people who had actually engaged in violence, it undercut the possibility for reconciliation and especially for justice. And so Ubu and the Truth Commission is very much entering into those conversations. So the play starts actually very much sort of bringing up a lot of the same kind of grotesque themes that we see in Jarry's version. Scene one, a very short scene, we have a puppet making soup. Actually, interestingly, I should point this out now at the beginning, the only two characters played by human actors are Pa Ubu and Ma Ubu. Every other character is played by a puppet. So that's kind of an interesting thing. And part of the logic behind that decision is because Pa Ubu is implicated in the violence of the apartheid state, it makes apparent the human perpetrators, the human beings responsible for apartheid violence. So that happens. Act 1, Scene 2. So Act 1, Scene 1 is just silent. It is literally us watching a puppet make some soup, taste some soup, etc., etc. Then in Act 1, Scene 2, Pa Ubu comes in, kicks over the puppet, kicks over the soup without realizing it. And then it says here, as Pa Ubu strides on stage, he kicks over the soup maker with no evident sense of what it is that he has done. The puppet drops and is carried off by one of the two puppeteers. The other puppeteer is transformed into Ma Ubu, who proceeds with the scene. Pa Ubu strikes a pose, holding his injured foot as if he had stubbed it on a stone. And then the first line of the play is shit. I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce it. Pschitt. If you watched my video on Alfred Jarry's Ubu Roi, you will remember that in the English translation I was working from, the first line is shitski. In the French, it's merdre, which is a corruption of the French word merde for shit. So it's some variation of shit is the first line, and Taylor's version picks up on that. Shit, I guess, is, I don't speak Afrikaans, which is a sort of derivation of Dutch, basically. It looks to me somewhat more Afrikaans-y as a variation of the basic word shit. But then basically we have this sort of opening scene these opening several scenes with tension between Pa and Ma Ubu, because she suspects that he's been going out and consorting with prostitutes and stuff. And we kind of find out he's actually been engaged in theft of official government finances, as well as later on we learn that he's been involved in a lot of violence on behalf of the apartheid state. So we get those things. And one of the really unique production elements of the original performance, at least, is there's a lot of use of projectors, a lot of use of visual, non-physical visuals. And this version, which I'm reading in Helen Gilbert's anthology Post-Colonial Plays, great anthology, includes at least some of those depictions. So for instance, we get this set of illustrations that were projected on the back wall during these opening scenes. So as things in the play occur, we get those sort of mirrored in the visuals that form a backdrop for the action of the play itself. At the beginning of Act 2, we get the first of several TRC witnesses. And this was a really common thing that people incorporated into South African plays responding to the TRC, either critiquing it or endorsing it. People included testimony because the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was, theater people immediately sort of said, this is performative. This has a setting, this has dialogue to some degree, even though it was largely improvisational dialogue. This has recognizable characters, etc., etc. The TRC was extraordinarily performative. And so theater people really picked up on that. And one of the things a lot of theater people who wrote Truth and Reconciliation plays, either directly about it or peripheral to it, they incorporated testimony into those plays. And Ubu and the Truth Commission does the same thing. We have a number of scenes where people give testimony. And actually later in the play, we have a scene where Pa Ubu gives testimony to what would be the Amnesty Committee. That was the group. There were different committees depending on what type of testimony was being given in the TRC. The Amnesty Committee was the committee that heard testimony from perpetrators of apartheid violence. But the first one that we get, the first apartheid witness, TRC witness that we get, is actually someone whose family was killed in violence. So much like the actual structure of the TRC itself, the witness gives testimony. I don't know what language this is. It's an indigenous South African language. I don't speak any South African languages or read any South African languages, so this could be Zulu, this could be Xhosa, this could be Bantu, this could be any number of languages. I don't know, but we get the language of the original speaker, and then we get the translator. And that was a big thing, actually, in the TRC, because it was meant to bring all of South Africa together. And so witnesses could give testimony in their own language. And then the TRC employed translators who would translate it into major South African languages, but also local dialects. So theoretically, everybody or almost everybody had access to the testimony. So that's one of the things that we get that's really interesting here. Pa Ubu is encouraged to testify, to describe his crimes, to explain what he has done, and to seek amnesty, and he basically refuses. And so much of the play ends up centering around Pa Ubu's attempts to avoid culpability for the things that he's done. to avoid being held responsible for his actions. Ma Ubu does so Pa Ubu, the way that he tries to sort of cover up his crimes, they have a suitcase that is also an alligator named Niles, and Pa Ubu stuffs a bunch of documents into Niles' mouth. Then Ma Ubu retrieves them by opening the suitcase portion. Ma Ubu then sort of goes on TV to denounce Pa Ubu. Basically, she goes on TV and tells all of his secrets, at which point he is quite furious with her. So that becomes a whole thing. But then Pa Ubu comes up with a kind of solution to this problem. He's visited by the Pa Ubu shadow figure, which is, I don't know, the inner mind of Pa Ubu, something like this. The himself from earlier days where he was more engaged in criminality and and apartheid violence, something like this. And what the shadow suggests is, I have another suggestion. Shift the burden of guilt. Take the initiative. Find a name and remove yourself from all trace of blame. Extract yourself from the plot of your own history. So basically, Pa Ubu decides that he is going to frame someone else for his crimes. And the figure that he lands on to frame is his three-headed dog, Brutus. Kind of ironic that here, in William Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, it is Brutus who betrays Caesar. Here it is Brutus who's betrayed by Pa Ubu. Pa Ubu basically fixes all the documents and evidence and things like this, turns Brutus in, but then when Brutus is sentenced just to jail time, Pa Ubu realizes that if Brutus goes to the amnesty committee and implicates Pa Ubu, that he could still be in danger. So Pa Ubu breaks Brutus out of jail and hangs his three-headed dog. And we get this picture, we get this image on the projector of Brutus being executed. Pa Ubu then goes before the amnesty committee and attempts to testify, calls for justice, sort of drown out his testimony. And then the last portion of the play, Act 5, actually once again returns us to Alfred Jarry's Ubu Roi, because Pa and Ma Ubu are on a boat sailing away from apartheid, or from post-apartheid South Africa, sailing away from responsibility for their various crimes, sailing away from everything they've done wrong. And in this case, they're joined by Niles, the alligator suitcase, or crocodile suitcase, whatever it is. So that raises really interesting questions. In Jarry's play, it's an interesting ending because Papa Ubu has committed a bunch of violence. He has murdered the King of Poland. He's ruled as a kind of despotic ruler, executed a bunch of nobles, etc., and he's not made to pay for his crimes. Here, Pa Ubu embezzled money from the state and committed violence, racially motivated violence, on behalf of the apartheid government. And he once again escapes responsibility. And again, this was a big concern of South Africans, particularly Black South Africans, with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was if someone testified to the Amnesty Committee and honestly told the things that they had done, they would not be penalized for it. They were given amnesty. And so that raised a lot of questions about what justice was going to mean in the new South Africa.